You're listening to the Coach's Journey podcast, exposing the struggles and celebrating the successes in the life of coaches who are action takers and creating authentic impact in today's world. Whether you're just starting out, expanding your reach, or exploding your impact, you're in the right place right now. Stay tuned and be sure to subscribe to this podcast. Now, here are your hosts of the Coach's Journey podcast.
What's up, Coaches Nation? It's Dr. Sheri with another episode of the Coach's Journey podcast, here with my co-host for the week, Faisal Ensaun. And we've been talking about what are the skill sets, not just of the average coach, but the skill sets of an extraordinary coach, because that's what we aspire to be, is always be extraordinary, to be even more extraordinary, just never be satisfied or complacent with our impact and our abilities as a coach. So when we think about what are those skill sets that we can intentionally be aware of to cultivate even more, that's what we're going to talk about today. So if you don't want to be the average, the typical, the mundane coach, and you want to be extraordinary, this is the episode for you to listen to.
That's right. And I love that you said aspire, because in my head, am I an extraordinary coach? Am I? So I was like battling them, like, okay, aspire I can do.
Yeah. Well, and even I might have an extraordinary coaching session, but if I get too ego driven, then that's when I start to get complacent. I'm like, and I've noticed this, like I'll have a really good session and a client will like give me praise and just really like, they're on fire as a client and they tell me and it feels so good. But that doesn't mean that I am always extraordinary. So every session, every client demands the best of us and demands us to be on point and to be consciously thinking about how can I deliver my best in the moment. So I think it's also worth just reminding ourselves that you can have an extraordinary session and still not be extraordinary.
Yeah, and vice versa. You could have a crappy session and still be an extraordinary coach, because that happens all the time.
Good point. Good point. So just because you have a bad session, I love that. I love that. All right, so let's jump in. What's the first one that you want that we can tackle today?
Actually, we had the order, but active listening is the first one, I would say.
What'd you say?
I was thinking about the order before. We had questions first, but let's start with active listening.
Did you see that I wasn't active?
All right. Yeah, you're good joke. But before we move forward, definitely we want to hear your perspective on this. So we're not sitting here saying that we know all the foundational skills. We're making it up based on where we are.
Yeah.
Where we are and what we've learned from other amazing coaches on our journey. So if we miss something, definitely share with us. Or if you want to expand on something, share that with us below so we can learn from you as well. Definitely like and share this post, because these conversations are needed for us to show up better with our clients. And ultimately, I would say the judge of whether or not you are an extraordinary coach needs to be your clients, or more specifically, the results that your clients are getting. Not based on our perception, but we can definitely have a dialogue around it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just want to reiterate, I had a conversation 2 days ago with another coach, and she commented that one of the things she loves about our podcast is that we are being real, and we're not pretending or trying to present ourselves like we know everything and we have life figured out, because we don't know everything. We don't have all of life figured out. We are still in the journey of becoming and staying extraordinary, and really trying to figure out, okay, well, what works? What's the next level look like? And then what's the next level after that? So we're coming to you and doing this podcast based on our own experiences, as Faisal said, based on those around us. And we are always open to feedback, and we do not have life entirely figured out.
Yeah. Yesterday, I actually had a coaching call with one of my clients, and he's been my client for 4+ years at this point. And he's actually considering becoming a coach in 1 year time. So he's going through a really rough period right now. And one of his first things that he shared was very odd. He's like, I don't know how I'm going to become a coach. I'm a mess right now. And it's like, and I stopped him, like, you're making a big assumption that I've got my shit figured out. He's like, well, I guess you don't. But I mean, it was just like people make assumptions about people as like when they talk, or and even from a coach's perspective, one of the things that I try to do with my clients, even that just because we're going through this session, just because I'm your coach, it does not mean that I have everything figured out or anything. I have a set of skill sets. Yes, I believe that as a coach, I'm client zero. I believe that as a coach, I need a coach myself. I have my own blind spots. But what I can promise is that I'll be honest and open whenever that comes up, whenever I'm aware of it. And I will definitely drop the ball on certain things, and you can call me out on that if you're aware of it. But I'm just another human being who's trying to figure out his life. And that goes the same for coaches. And like nobody has the perfect blueprint for coaching, and it's such a creative work that I don't think there is. Like there are some foundational areas, but everybody's art come into it. And I think that's what makes coaching magical, is your own art that comes into it. We're just covering some areas around.
So humility, I would say, is going to fall into one of these categories that we're going to talk about. But the first one is active listening.
What?
I was going to see if you're good. Active listening. So, what is active listening? Active listening from my lens is being able to truly dial into what the other person is saying on multiple levels. There is the surface level of, so what you said was, if they said ABC, you say DEF, because you're trying to, you're either repeating what they say exactly or you're paraphrasing. That's kind of the surface level. As you get really good at coaching and just communicating in general, this is where the extraordinary coach gets to shine, because instead of just repeating back the surface things, you start to reflect back to them the things that they weren't even aware of that were present in how they were, in what they were saying or how they were saying it, getting to the emotional level of what you're seeing or feeling in what they're saying, pulling out patterns, connecting things like, oh, well, 3 months ago, and then 3 weeks ago, and now today, like I'm seeing this pattern. These are all aspects of active listening, because you're truly hearing, processing, fitting it into a larger context, and then helping the client be aware of it. That's how I think of active listening. How do you think of active listening?
I don't know what the hell you just said, but what I wanted to say.
Okay, not active listening, folks. Thank you for that demonstration, Faisal.
But so, I mean, what's not active listening is when you're listening to somebody and you're formulating your own thoughts while you're listening to somebody, and you have of course, your thoughts are going to go on, but we can have thoughts that go on and you don't engage them. But you can have thoughts that go on, but you're engaging them. You're having a conversation in your hand versus when somebody's talking. So while I was listening to Sheri, some of that was coming up. I'm like, I kept pulling myself back. But great perspective, definitely. And there's so many pieces that you shared that come into it. Is one is just listening to the words, but there's a lot more than words. I mean, most of communication we know is well over 90% is their body language, tonality, so many things that come into it. And also, if you have a history with a client, all that comes into it. The context comes in, because without context, it's very hard to make sense of what they're saying. And also being really good at not only understanding them, but reflecting back to them something that that makes sense to them. And even if it doesn't, if it's not something that they fully said, you can check in with them. Hey, is there something else that I missed? And that's one of my habits, that even if I'm reflecting back to somebody, I'll ask them, like, is there something, especially if I see something change on, did I miss something? There's something I'm missing. But there's a lot more in there. You're reading a lot more even behind the words, but you're always checking with the client. You're not assuming, you're not making assumptions. And and this is the hard part that I've learned in the listening piece, is that, and this is where preparation comes in for coaches. Before you jump on the call, where's your mind at? Where's your energy at. And I think at this point, after years of doing this, it's actually a lot of my preparation is not in the area of let me figure out all the things that I need to remember about the client. I have some basic notes and a lot of things that I remember about a client, especially I've worked with them one-on-one. But a lot of my preparation, I would say, even if I have 10 minutes, I'll spend about 60-70% of it on my physiology and my own intention and where my thoughts are, especially if I'm going through a rough day. And I know that I'm going to bring in my energy into it. If I'm not working through that, I'm not going to be able to listen to the person because I'm bringing my own things. And within the session, am I checking in with myself? Like, are my thoughts like the monkey in my head is going on and just creating judgments, or am I actually present and fully being there? So with active listening, and this is why it's called active listening, because it actually takes a lot of energy. If you just spent an hour really listening to somebody, you would be drained. You would be drained and you didn't say much. You would really be drained because you're actually taking in what they're saying and noticing. And then on top of that, add to other pieces of coaching that comes in, it's very hard to navigate. So one part of it is listening to the words, but a big part of it is looking, if they're on video, looking at their body language and actually noticing their emotions on their faces, and I think feeling their energy. I think we feel people's energy. And then their tonality. And that requires presence. I don't think without presence, there's active listening, because as soon as you go in your own story and head, you lose presence with the person.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just reflecting back that there have been a couple sessions that I have done, and I've been like 5 minutes before the session, I was a hot mess because of an argument or just something that was going on in my life. And like I was literally crying the hour before because of my own stuff. And then, but as a coach, this is my belief as a coach, it's my job to figure out how to package that up and set it aside. And fortunately, over the years, as a psychologist and listening to a lot of really intense stories from client to client to client, back to back, and just I have gotten really good at compartmentalizing my own stuff or even another client's stuff from another client. So I do see that as a gift and a skill set that I have cultivated. Now, an aside is like that compartmentalization cannot happen forever. It's not a long-term solution, but it is a way that I'm able to put that aside, get present, and then be present for my client. So just being aware of that process for you. And if you don't have a process around that, create that process, because that is really critical for you to be able to show up fully for that person. And there have been times where I've heard you do this, Faisal, as well, that, beginning of the session, you might notice that your client is distracted and still has baggage left over from their, maybe work meeting or whatever, and needing to like a moment to breathe, get recentered to the moment. So if our clients need that sometimes, so do we. So how we enter into the session, I think, is really important to how our ability to actively listen kind of pans out.
Yeah, for sure. And then that's as soon as a client jumps on, like you're on. Because before they even speak, just their energy, if you're not noticing that, because one of the things that happen often for me, and it happens in different waves, but like client will jump on and just like Sheri was saying, like they're going 100 miles an hour. You can tell in their speech. It's so fast and it's not coherent fully. To them, it sounds coherent, but it's like, what? And their energy is frantic or they're anxious about something. They're not like, because it's such a normal part of what they're doing in that day. To them, it looks normal. But if you're present with them, you'll notice. And often I would say my clients who've been with me long enough, they know to actually set an intention for the call, because they know if they don't, I'm going to catch them on that. So what would happen is I'd stop and I'm like, before we get into the issues, can I just walk you through something? And usually people say yes. That's rarely, especially if it's a client who's like, okay, I'll literally walk them through a breathing exercise of some kind or a movement of some kind. And then I'm like, how do you feel? And they start talking. You can tangibly see the difference in their speech pattern and how they feel. Even if they don't feel, they will feel different. But even if they don't feel different, and I'll tell them, like, do you notice that you're speaking differently? Do you notice your body language? Yes. I'm like, can you do that for your next meeting? Just that, if you didn't do anything else in that session, just interrupting that pattern that a client had, that's incredibly valuable for a client. And right there.
And I would say, Faisal, that you're actually introducing another skill set in the mix. And I think it's important to recognize, first of all, these skill sets are not independent of each other. They very much flow into each other and support each other. So when you get better in one, you might notice, oh, I really need to also work on this at the same time, or one naturally improves with another. So the next skill set that this kind of rolls into is one of emotional intelligence. And what I love about the whole idea of emotional intelligence when it emerged in the research is that it is something we absolutely have control over. So many years, there was this idea of intelligence was static, you were born with it, and it is what it is. But as this idea of emotional intelligence has come out, and the idea of intelligence itself, and what does it mean, and what's the definition, and how does it show up, I think is so fascinating. And so emotional intelligence has a number of components to it. But it's very much the way that I see it, or the way that I describe it, is it's very much being attuned to other people and yourself, and being able to adjust and navigate conversation, relationship, and the pattern of being to accommodate how the other person is. So it's not that I'm changing who I am to be different with somebody, but it's kind of like I'm filling in the gaps. I can adjust a little bit to make sure that I am fully there and fully understanding kind of what's happening. How would you do you want to take it from there?
Yeah. It's funny, as you're talking about emotional intelligence, a lot of emotions are coming up, which is very interesting. So I will share this in a couple of different ways. First of all, I think there are levels of everything, any kind of intelligence. You could have emotional intelligence in certain contexts, but not in other contexts. So as a baseline, I agree what you're saying is that it's your awareness of your own emotions and how you navigate those, and awareness of other people's emotions. And I love this one spiritual teacher one time said years ago, that we live in the emotional dark ages, that we have our mind is intellect is so engaged, our body is less and less engaged, so we're disconnected from how we feel a lot of times, because if you're not engaged to the body, it's very hard to notice what you feel. And we're in the world of mind, we're the world of ideas and intellect, and in that world, a lot of times you don't you don't navigate emotions that much. And on top of that, if you live in that world, you don't notice people, you notice their ideas, you notice their thoughts, you notice their words, you don't notice people. And this is why I think emotional intelligence, human beings have been aware of it for thousands of years. It's become a new thing. It's come up in research, people are talking about it more because it's a need. People are realizing that we're distracted, we're not paying attention to people, and so I think it's by that need that is coming up, we're wanting to research it more, understand it more, and everybody has different levels of it. And I feel like I've grown in that area, but there are areas that I struggle with. Literally this past weekend, I had a blowout with my wife, and I lost my shit, and I got shocked myself. Like at the end of it, I was so shocked, and my wife was shocked. And I literally threw things around. I didn't realize the last time that something like that happened was 2 years ago. And I worked on it for this long, and then this came out of nowhere. And I literally lied down, tried to figure out and it's been the past few days, I've been trying to figure out what's happening. And I know that it's connected to a part of me that's hard for me to access. And in the world of therapy, like we have a model around coaching and therapy, internal family systems, where inside of you, there's not just one person, there are multiple voices and a lot of it is actually connected to partly towards your trauma that you might have not fully processed. You might have not fully made sense of it. And to me, it was obvious. And one of the first things after I thought about it for a day, my instinct was, it's been 2 years. I haven't been able to figure it out. So what do? Send a message to a coach I know. Can you help me with this?
Yeah. And I think it's also important to affirm it has been 2 years.
Yeah.
This isn't an every weekend occurrence. And so at the same time that you are growing in some of these areas, there are these moments that, it's like the curtains open and you're like, oh yeah, I've grown. It's still, but it's still there. So I love that. And in my own life, I have found less my marital relationship and more of my parenting relationships is where I have grown the most in my own emotional intelligence. And so I think about how that could play out with clients. And definitely it has been my self-regulation. I have and self-awareness. I have definitely grown in my self-awareness, although my self-awareness has been fairly high for some time, but my self-regulation as a parent hasn't been. And so really being able to, there are certain attributes, personality characteristics that some of my kids have that just grate on my nerves, like just in my natural state, I'm very reactive to. And so it's been a hard lesson, hard journey that I'm still on, but being able to see what they're saying and this ties into the active listening and be like, okay, what are they really saying? Not just what they're saying, but what are they really saying? And I've gotten actually, in my own opinion, significantly better at these certain interactions that I have with a certain ones of my kids. And now I'm noticing, like my husband, I'm like, oh man, he needs to grow in this area. And so like sometimes I'll like interject because they're like escalating and I see what's going on. And I'm like, part of me is like, that's not me anymore. The other part of me, or not all the time anyway, I'm certainly not perfect. But
Is that the emotionally intelligent part of you?
yeah, probably not. That would be the competitive, I'm right, like that part of me that's probably never gonna go away. But I can keep it down. And so now I have an opportunity instead of to join in the reactivity, I can be a third party to it and start to be a kind of a little bit of a moderator in that. And that's been helpful. But all parties involved, husband, kids, like we're all still trying to figure this thing out, but it's just interesting because I can see the growth in myself and then be able to just it's a journey and I'm on it too. And it's just interesting. And I think we need to, in the same way that I intentionally work with my clients, to honor them, to cheer them on, there was a client I met with a week ago, and I remember she said this thing and she just quickly moved on, and I was like, whoa, wait, stop. And I'm like,
those are the best parts.
I know. I'm like, did you just hear what you said? And I say it like that too. Like I do a lot of energy and like, what? Because I'm trying to like help them access that like energetic part of themselves that they just glossed over. And so yeah, it's fun to be able to do that. And we need to do that for ourselves as well. So I'm doing that for myself. I'm giving myself a little bit of kudos right now on my own growth here. And thank you, my self-awareness and self-regulation, the journey that is.
I want to celebrate you too. And by the way, this is one of those phrases, emotional intelligence, that a lot of people use. Very few people, in their experience, it's not apparent that they have it, or they have it at a level that they think they have it. It's true for, I think, everybody. Like we all have this perception that we have it, but we don't. But it's become like one of those things, like concepts that people kind of show off, but when you go into their experience, it doesn't exist as much. And yeah, I understand that there are levels of it, but they don't know how it shows up in their life. And usually it's an awareness of their own emotions. How reactive are they to their own emotions, and the thoughts that react with those emotions, and how aware are they of other people. And I want to talk about it quickly around a coaching context. So I was sharing before with Sheri, I have a client right now who I'm working, and this is a call where I'm with a client and one of his partners in his company. And when I started working with him one-on-one, I saw a lot of communication challenges. And then he didn't know how to directly share certain things. And I noticed that a lot of it was around emotions. It was less to do with words that he was sharing. But also when I talked to his partners, it was even worse on the other side. And they had been working together for years. I'm like, there's a complete break in there. And the way they would talk with me when I would ask him questions, whenever I would ask him a question, well, he does this, this, and this. It would always be about the other person. There was very little accountability on their own side. And then finally, after a few weeks of working on, I'm like, would you be open to getting on a call together? Because I would give him a challenge to go work through this, and they wouldn't be able to. And it's probably one of the more challenging things that I've done as a client with these, and actually with a family that I've worked with and with couples. It's very hard to navigate these conversations, especially if there's like years of stuff, perceptions left over. So what people generally do is they kind of box the other person into 5 years ago that they knew them. It's like, well, this is how this person is, but they've grown past that. And so what in today's call, for example, what kept happening was, well, this is why my partner is not moving forward. I think it's because of his confirmation bias, not realizing that he has a confirmation bias in the process, in the moment, and just going on and on. And then I would stop him, like, do you feel that that's true? The other person, and they're saying completely, no, that's not true. I've grown past it. I'm trying to move past that. And then the other person, no, I feel like he's there. And the whole call was like this. Like this person had made up his mind around how the other person is.
Yeah.
There's no way there can be any movement forward. And it was, but the point here is, like, a lot of it was a challenge around emotions. The person A didn't know how to express and actually assertively say, hey, don't define who I am. Take my word for it and let my actions define what I've become or not. And person B is like not budging because they're emotionally stuck in their perception in some other place and history.
Yeah.
And it becomes like, if you ever do a call like that, it becomes your job as a coach to help them move forward. And I'd like to think the call moved forward today. But in most cases, coaches who are starting out, they'll be dealing with individuals who are stuck in their perceptions of themselves, other people, and they're emotionally attached to that process. And they can't let it go. Like, and that's one piece of how that could happen. But your ability to navigate, and this is why we say, like, when we're sharing our own vulnerable experiences, is that your client zero, if you haven't tackled these things in your own life, and it doesn't mean you have to resolve everything, because there's a journey, but if you haven't tackled them, you're not going through that growth process yourself, and then you haven't navigated that with other people. And in your mind, you're saying, I'm an incredible coach. And then you start working with somebody, you're like, oh shit, this is hard.
And I love what you said a few minutes ago. Basically, what it reminded me of is we never really know how emotionally intelligent we are. And the reason I say that is because once we have achieved a certain level, that is where our awareness is at. And so you might think like, oh, I'm great. Well, that's because that's where your awareness at. How can you be aware of what you're not aware of yet? And so, that's the fundamental question. So I think it's just this trust that no matter where we're at in this journey of learning how to be more emotionally aware and self-regulated and being able to connect with other people on an emotional level and being all of these things, that no matter where we're at, there is always another level of doing that. It's just we're not aware yet. Therefore, we think we might think we're there. And what you said, Faisal, then kind of leads us into our third skill set category, and that's around relationships. And to be really skilled at navigating relationships as a coach kind of requires that high level of emotional intelligence in ourselves and in being able to recognize where our clients are at. And I want to preface this because we had this conversation, Faisal and I, that understanding relationships and how they work well doesn't necessarily mean you're a relationship coach, doesn't even necessarily mean that you have two people that you are working with at the same time. Because even as an individual, I'm constantly acting and reacting to these relationships I'm in. It's just they're not physically present here in the moment. And so just kind of wanted to, so if you think you're like, I don't deal with relationships, this doesn't apply to you or me, you might still want to listen.
By the way, there are coaches who think that, and I think they're completely mistaken in this area where they're like, I'm a productivity coach. So if you're not tackling relationship challenges in their productivity, they're more than likely distracted because of the emotions generated by the reactions generated within the relationships.
And in fact, the most common reason I do a lot of coaching around productivity in real estate with investors and agents and brokers, the number one thing that people ultimately realize is their biggest productivity challenge is their relationship with themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a relationship.
Yeah.
So really everything boils down to relationship, I think, at the most basic level.
And I would say number two to that is relationship with the people around them. Like they're not effective because they can't communicate boundaries. They're not effective because they need to please people. They're not effective because they can't express what they really want out in the world. Like they are connected to their emotional intelligence, but they're also connected to how they navigate their relationships, how they communicate, how in learning how to communicate is a skill set in itself. Influence is a skill set in itself. So how do people do that? By the way, I wanted to mention each of these we can do a whole episode, literally. So we're kind of covering like tip of the iceberg. So we do want to hear from you. Share your thoughts around this, and we might not even get to this six months, because if we go into relationships, I have a lot to say there. Maybe we'll cover part of it, and then maybe we'll expand on it afterwards. But there's a lot to be said in these areas, and then we want to hear from you. How have you navigated that in your coaching sessions? How have you shown up better as a coach, prepared to deal with these areas? And maybe we're mistaken. Maybe it doesn't need to be like this. Maybe there's a different approach to this. We want to hear that because we want to learn from you as well.
Awesome. When I think about relationship coaching, let me rephrase that. Coaching with someone with a relationship perspective. Just as an example, just a couple days ago, I had a session with a gentleman. He's not married, he's divorced. And the reason we started coaching wasn't around relationships. However, he would like to be in a relationship. And so we had talked a little bit about his values and what is important in life and how can we work to increase his integrity in amping up the areas of his life that aren't entirely meeting his values. And then it transitioned into, and how do these values show up in a future mate or your past exes that didn't work? And it was really interesting. He was able to gain some significant insights into why those past relationships didn't sit right with him, and kind of affirmed how he could potentially look for the next next girlfriend,
The next guinea pig,
right? The next guinea pig, yes. And and at the end, it was interesting. He said something it took me by surprise, and he said something to the effect of, "Well, you really did an amazing job at coaching around relationships." And I thought to myself, like, why wouldn't I? Like, this is just part of the coaching journey, part of understanding how to work with somebody. But in this context, understanding relationships and how a person, even if you're working with an individual, what their concept of relationships are and the boundaries and what they're wanting and not wanting, like these are pretty critical conversations that lead back to an emotional intelligence. How self-aware was he in his values? How self-aware was he, or aware of how that was then interacting with this other person and his emotional reaction to them when they violated his values, but he didn't realize that's what happened. And so there's just so much fun material to uncover. I don't know. I love this. I love these topics.
Yeah, and it's so complex. There's so much in there, whether you're working with somebody who has a team or somebody's navigating challenges or areas they want to grow in their relationship with their spouse or their kids. And a lot of our challenges are there. So I work with real estate investors as well, just like Dr. Sheri. And I would say almost 95% of the time, they will come to me with a challenge around their lack of focus or lack of strategy to move in a certain direction in their business or something like that. And those could also be challenges, but about 90% of the time, it ends up being some kind of relationship challenge. 90% relationship challenge every time. So this is why, like, by the way, this is how I've also expanded my coaching business, which is very interesting. It happened organically. I had no evil plan around it. So here's how it happens often for me. I'll start working with the real estate investor, and we go through a few sessions. And within those first few sessions, we find out very quickly that their challenge is actually they don't know how to express themselves. They don't know how to share ideas with those around them. They don't know how to share a vision. They don't know how to say no to people. They don't know how to not be a people pleaser. They don't know how to be aware of their emotions and not react to their team and other people. They don't know how to read other people around them. They don't know how to be there present. Almost everything ties back to their relationships, and it's in our nature. We're a social species. So here's what ends up happening. I give them the space to go deal with it. I'll give them challenges, tools, all sorts of stuff. But at some point, by the time we hit like 6, 7, 8 session, they kind of feel a little bit defeated because it's hard. They feel defeated. Sometimes they are able to move forward in a positive direction. A lot of times they struggle with it. So what I would invite them to do is, hey, I'm open to speaking with your spouse. I'm open to speaking with your team member. I'll do it as a bonus. I just want to see where it's at. If maybe they need to be supported, and that might be true. And I'll say, like, I won't charge for this. I'll just do it. That becomes, one, a referral. Two, it ends up being that I actually end up working with team members, and then, or I start working with the couples, or they will bring their kids into the picture. It's happened so many times that it's almost, at this point, I know within 6 months, I'm working with their business partner or a life partner or a team member of some kind. And they're working on it together. And I think we are more than individuals. We're a unit. Human beings are a unit. We're either a family unit, a team unit, organizational unit, or a community unit. If you don't know what's going on there, it's very hard to navigate. You can help them all you want, but they will go back to that environment and they will revert back to their old patterns. So my passion around this became is like, and it's so interesting when you bring other people, you hear perspective. Often whatever their assumptions are, they're not, 80% of them are not true. And they don't know how to understand the other person. The other person doesn't know how to communicate to them what they are and what they mean. And that's also true for our own life a lot of times. So for me, it's made the world of coaching so interesting. That's why at times I'm doing couples coaching. At times I'm working with business partners. I've had to challenge myself to build these. And at times I've had to go, I'm like, this is beyond my skill set. Can you work with couples? Can you work with them at this point? You're a trauma coach. Can you come in and help them with this emotional thing that I don't know how to navigate? So it's expanded a lot of my coaching skill set because I've been open to this. And I would say, a lot of times I've also noticed, and this stops coaches a lot of times too, when they run into these things, they don't actually they're not open to the challenge, coaches. So when somebody's having an issue with their partner, they will work with them, but they will never invite them. Hey, I can see if I can support them, or I can see if I can connect them to somebody who can support them. They don't want to give them, for some odd reason, I haven't seen that enough.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And it's interesting because even as you were saying that, I had a dialogue running in the back of my mind from when I was licensed and around some of the language in the ethics code about not working outside of your skill set, of your competency is the way that it's worded. And that is a whole nother podcast. but they're so like at what point, how I'm gonna leave this question. I don't want us to try to answer this because it really deserves more time. But the question is, how do we push ourselves to growth and while also do we work within our competency or not? And like, how do we grow if we're always just in our competency? So I'm just going to leave that question hanging because it's a really good question. I do want us to transition into our next one, which is around the ability to effectively challenge our clients. Because in these relationship contexts, this kind of comes up in what you were sharing, Faisal, and that's part of our job. The way that I see it is to challenge our clients to change. If we're not like, why else would they be coming to us? Well, okay, sometimes we'll get a client. This has happened to me. Sometimes I've gotten a client that all they really want is for me to side with them, agree with them so they can feel appeased. Yes, the world sucks. Life isn't like, sometimes that's like, there's this emotional comfort that they're seeking. and they don't really want to be challenged. But more often than not, they really want challenged. Like, and especially I would say in the coaching space. I think the other aspect happened more often in the mental health world, probably as a function of the amount of money one has to pay for therapy versus coaching. If they have a $10 copay, then they might be willing to pull the trigger on meeting with somebody just so they can like be justified in how they're feeling. Whereas I don't know that somebody's going to be as likely to pay me as a coach out of their own pocket the amount of money for that same thing. So let's just assume that part of our job is to effectively challenge people so we can help them usher in change and growth in their life. That's a really important skill set.
And I would say another reason around this is like, look at what Brendan Burchard once was on a podcast I was listening to, and the host asked, I think you like her, the podcast host, it's that lady that you talk about. She has a big podcast and she's in the influencer world. Forget her name, pretty lady. And okay, anyway, so maybe I shouldn't have said pretty lady if my wife is listening to, but so she was asking Brendan, is like, what do you do as a coach? And Brendan said it very clearly in one statement. And that was very, like, when he said it, I'm like, okay, that makes sense. He said, as a trainer, I teach people a lot of things. I train on a lot of things, but as a coach, I actually just, the main reason why I get paid highly as a coach is to help my clients get results in their life. Help my clients, and results are usually forward movement. Something needs to change. For something that needs to change, that requires challenge. If they were challenging themselves, they wouldn't need you. If they knew all the areas they needed to challenge themselves, they wouldn't need you to begin with. And then as coach, you're finding out areas of growth edges for people, and then you're challenging them to go one step. You're always living at the edge of growth with your client. And that's why I say in sessions, you as a coach, you need to feel just as uncomfortable as your client. If you're really comfortable, you're not pushing yourself either in terms of your skill sets.
Absolutely. And then within our ability to effectively challenge people, questions. That is our fifth skill set, is really asking good questions. The questions in and of themselves might be sufficient in a lot of situations for the challenge to be present. When I think of challenge, I think of Jillian Michaels, who's that fitness gal, like personal trainer. I think she was part of like The Biggest Loser, that whole TV show where people had to lose 100+ pounds in a certain amount of time. Anyway, and so like she's like a drill sergeant. She'd be yelling and like, getting mad at people and like, belittling them. And some people responded to that and were challenged by that. That's not necessarily what we mean by challenging people. You don't need to be a drill sergeant. Sometimes it is, and actually I think a lot of times it's through asking very emotionally attentive and thoughtful and empathic questions, and then just letting the client sit with that. And you're not asking a leading question, which I see that happen a lot. And sometimes I find myself like, well, you want this, don't you? No, like, well, what do you want? Just don't make assumptions. Ask some really powerful questions that are completely open, and you'll and the client will probably be surprised at the answers and kind of what gets uncovered.
Yeah. And I mean, there are so many levels to, like, open-ended questions are so important and coaching, because if you go with that assumption with the leading question, then you're making a bunch of assumptions in the background that by the way, I've like listened to my own sessions around that and other coaches' sessions. It's a very common thing for coaches to kind of box somebody into, I understand where this is going, so I'm going to ask a bunch of leading questions, and they get to end of it and they're like, I already knew this. or it didn't have the impact that they were hoping, or it wasn't even related to that, because they didn't actually understand, the client didn't understand the context enough, they didn't, because there wasn't enough open-ended questions involved in there. And questions, and the reason, like, even though like coaches look at this as one of the foundational areas of coaching, it can be a tool and it's also a skill set. when it comes to questions, it's connected to all the other areas that we're talking about. So if you're not actively listening, it's very hard to ask the right questions. It's very hard to ask follow-up questions. If you don't have challenge in mind, it's very hard to ask effective questions. If you don't understand somebody's context of life, where they're in relationships have influence on them, they have influence on them, it's very hard to ask those questions. And all those things come into it. But I mean, there's so much we can talk about when it comes to questions, and what are the right kinds of questions, what are the questions that will go completely not in the direction that you had hoped with a client. But at least as a starting point, I would say open-ended questions are very, very important. And which show you need to actually have curiosity and not assuming that you know what their life is about just because you know a couple of people's life or your own life, and not projecting that onto them, and really trying to understand. But more importantly, as you're asking these open-ended questions, the client begins to understand their own life. They begin to navigate it better. So you don't actually need to give them answers. You just need to ask the right questions.
Yes. I think this differentiation between questions are not necessarily intended to information gather, but rather they're intended to expose. Bring something up, expose. I know, right? That sounds
That's a little bit scary.
It is. And they're meant to I've experienced the best questions are ones that the client exposes something for the first time themselves. They'll think about the and they'll give the answer, and they'll be like, oh my, and they're surprised at their own answer. Those are so fun.
Yeah.
And the questions then lead into what is the ultimate goal of coaching? I think for most coaches, and definitely for myself, it's how can I, and this is a skill set, how can I help my client not just change, but sustain change towards a meaningful direction, towards something that they're intending to want to change or to see different or to move towards their potential. There's lots of different ways of saying it, but it's like it's not just change, but sustaining change as well, and helping them be on the path of that, so that, because I'm not going to be their coach for life. I mean, I'd be open to the idea, but the reality is I'm not going to be their coach for life. And in fact, when I was a therapist, when I was a psychologist, part of my intake phrase was, and my goal is to get to the point where you fire me because you don't need me anymore. Like that's my goal. Like really, that's what I'm aiming towards. And so that's a skill set. How do you support and provide them the resources so that they can then become independent in the things that you've helped them grow in?
Yeah, I love this so much. I think, and this is where like the distinction of older coaching, like some of the older principles of coaching, where it's like you just get on a call and you just hope that client gives you something, but there is no intention towards a movement towards something. That kind of dies out really fast. We've had actually coaches in our own chain where by the time and you're working with coaches who have done a lot of work on themselves. So I've had one coach a couple of years ago, who was part of our chain. In the middle of it, she sends me a message like, I'm really struggling with the chain. I don't know how to navigate. And I know what she was stuck with when she talked. She's like, I get on the call, when I ask him, what do you want to work through? What are your challenges? Because I have no challenges right now. I don't know what to say. And the coach didn't know how to navigate that because they didn't expand their vision. This coach didn't help them see a better version of themselves, a version of their life that could be better, a version of the quality of life. It doesn't always have to be around goals in terms of like business and other things, but a quality of life that's better, an experience of life that's better, an experience of health that's better, or experience of relationships that's better. But ultimately it comes down to like, what is somebody's potential? Nobody can determine that, but at least you can take them towards that direction. And this is where coaches might say that, are you coaching to an outcome? And you don't determine the outcome, they determine the outcome a lot of times. And this is where a lot of coaches will go in the specific details, become about goals, about vision, about their ideal self. All those things come in. Once you get that, and just the fact, if you can just help people clarify that for themselves, because most people don't have that clarity, that becomes incredible coaching for people. But once you help them go towards that and sustain that, that's a whole other level. Now they know that they're getting ROI and results out of it. Guess what they're going to do? They're going to refer you. They're going to talk about you in a good way to other people. not at the other side. But that's where I think coaching become more and more effective, because, and this is where I think the differentiation with the therapy comes in a lot of times, because therapy, like if you were to give a general, it tends to like help people make sense of where they are and help make sense of their past and help them process things. And that could be part of coaching. But I think the big differentiation is that what are the outcomes that they're gaining in the process? Are they going in a direction that they want to create in their life? And that's what people pay for.
Yeah. At the risk of oversimplification, I think therapy is like going to the doctor. I have the flu, help me get healthy again. Coaching, at least the kind of coaching that I do, is like somebody coming and saying, I want to learn how to live to 150. Like, one is, how do I take sickness to normal? The other one's like, how do you take normal to like way out there? Like, that's what gets me excited is what I do as a coach.
And you've done both sides of it. So that's a great analogy coming from an expert on both sides.
All right, we are out of time. And at the same time, we got all six. We did deep dive into all six. But
I really wanted to. I held my...
I know. You had great emotional intelligence.
Trained
to
myself.
Train yourself. So we're thinking about deep diving into these on individual podcasts, because they are incredibly worthy of really unpacking even more and thinking about the implications in our own lives as coaches, as well as our ability to be a better coach. And so if you, as Faisal said, if you have thoughts, ideas, perspectives you would like to share, please bring them our way. You can send an email to support@coachingmasterycommunity.com. You can send a message on whatever platform that you're seeing this. We would just love to hear from you and to be able to interact with you and your ideas and perspectives.
Yeah, for sure. And we definitely want to hear from because you have experience in this area. You are in sessions, you've worked on yourself. And part of what we're trying to do in Coaching Mastery Community is to gather data around what extraordinary coaching is. And we do have an agenda around that. When coaching does become regulated, when there is a standard process for coaching, we want to be at the forefront of like, hey, we actually have data from coaches who have actually done this and have gotten results for their clients. And we love to gather that, because we want to, and we're constantly doing that in our chain, we're doing that in our community. So that repository of data, it will become the foundations of what coaching might be, a lot like psychology, where psychologists are, psychotherapy is in the next few years. And who knows, it might even overtake that whole field in a lot of ways, or our combined forces, one or the other.
Right, absolutely. And if you've noticed internally that something is kind of excited about the idea of being with a group of coaches who have this intentionality and this focus, we have a membership that is incredibly supportive. There's information, but implementation, it's the place where you can get your needs met so that you don't get stuck at any level of being a coach. So if that's something you're like, yes, I totally want that, reach out to us. Again, you can send us an email or reach out to us on socials, however makes sense for you. We would love to have a conversation about that and see if you are the right fit for the coaching community that we have. And so if you love this episode, share it with another coach that you know, so that we can all grow and get better together.
And thank you very much. And we're excited to see you next week. Hope you have an incredible day. Bye.
Bye.
You're listening to the Coach's Journey podcast.